If you tried to find Europe's most valuable land, you would probably start with London, Paris, Monaco, or Switzerland. You would be looking in the wrong places. In one flat Dutch province, ordinary farmland now averages about $88,000 an acre, roughly 65,000 pounds. Less than a century ago, much of that land was underwater. In northern Sweden, remote ground contains rare earth elements Europe needs for electric motors and wind turbines. And along the North Sea, ordinary stretches of coastline have become critical because enormous amounts of cargo and electricity have to pass through them. None of these places looks particularly valuable on a map. But that's the problem with the map. Europe has an obvious geography of wealth and another one almost nobody sees. And once you understand what makes these places so valuable, Europe starts to look completely different. The first place to see it is Rotterdam. Rotterdam sits on the Dutch coast, near the western edge of Europe. It doesn't look like the center of the continent because technically it isn't. But in 2024, Rotterdam handled roughly 397 million metric tons of freight, more than any other port in the European Union. Antwerp-Bruges handled about 244 million. Hamburg handled around 97 million. Rotterdam moved more than those two major ports combined. And the reason is not simply that someone built a giant harbor there. Look behind Rotterdam on the map and you find the Rhine-Meuse Delta, the entrance to a river system reaching deep into some of the richest and most industrialized parts of Europe. A ship can cross an ocean, unload here, and send cargo inland toward Germany, France, Switzerland, and beyond. Rotterdam is valuable because an enormous part of Europe sits behind it. You can rebuild docks. You cannot rebuild that location. Follow the Rhine inland and this becomes easier to see. Warehouses, factories, rail terminals, and inland ports cluster around the river because heavy goods can move through a route geography already provided. The river reaches major industrial regions in Germany before continuing toward Switzerland, connecting inland Europe to the North Sea. Put the exact same warehouse in the wrong place, and it becomes less useful. Put the exact same port on a coastline without access to major inland markets, and it becomes less valuable. This is the first thing a normal map of European wealth misses. Land does not need luxury apartments or expensive houses sitting on top of it to matter. Sometimes the valuable thing is simply what can pass through it. And just beyond Rotterdam, the North Sea is creating another version of the same effect. For centuries, the North Sea was valuable mainly for fishing, shipping, and access to ports. Now it is becoming something closer to an enormous power plant. Countries surrounding it are building huge offshore wind projects with long-term plans that could eventually produce hundreds of gigawatts of power. But putting thousands of turbines offshore creates a very physical problem. The electricity has to come back. Undersea cables need places to reach the coast. That power needs substations and connections strong enough to move it into the grid. Suddenly, an ordinary stretch of coastline can become strategically important because there are only so many practical places where enormous amounts of electricity can enter the continent. Rotterdam showed the value of moving cargo. The North Sea shows the same rule with energy. But electricity creates another problem most people never see. A wind turbine may run without coal or oil, but it still has to be built from something. So do electric cars, batteries, transmission lines, and the motors inside them. Copper carries electricity. Lithium and nickel are important to batteries. Rare earth elements are used in powerful permanent magnets. Europe imports much of what it needs, which has made the ground containing these materials increasingly important. In 2025, the European Union identified 47 projects inside the bloc as strategically important for critical raw materials. And some of the most interesting ones are nowhere near Europe's traditional centers of wealth. One sits more than 100 miles inside the Arctic Circle. That takes us to northern Sweden. Around Kiruna and Malmberget, mining has shaped the landscape for generations. Kiruna is so closely tied to mining that buildings in the town have literally been moved as the giant iron ore mine expanded underground. But the region now matters for something else. Nearby Pergeir contains rare earth elements, and a larger project connecting Pergeir, Malmberget, and processing in Luleå has been recognized by the European Commission as strategically important. These materials can be used in permanent magnets needed for technologies like electric motors and wind turbines. So ground near a remote Arctic town can connect directly to cars, power systems, and industries operating thousands of miles away. Its value is almost invisible from the surface. Travel more than 2,000 miles south, and the same basic rule appears again. Portugal had 4 projects in the EU's first group of strategic raw material projects, including projects connected to lithium and copper. Portugal is better known outside the country for Lisbon, beaches, and tourism than for the rock beneath its interior. But lithium is important to rechargeable batteries, while copper is fundamental to wiring, motors, and power grids. The more Europe tries to electrify cars, heating, and industry, the more physical material it needs to make that possible. Replacing an oil-powered car with an electric one does not remove geography from the equation. It changes the geography that matters. A Dutch port, a windy coastline, Arctic rock, and the Portuguese interior have almost nothing in common when you look at them. But they reveal the same hidden rule. Land becomes unusually important when something people depend on is difficult to replace. And even that is only half the equation. A mineral deposit can sit unused if nobody can mine or transport it. An offshore wind farm is limited without a grid connection. A port without roads, rivers, or customers is just a harbor. Having the resource is not enough. It needs infrastructure around it and a market that wants what it can provide. And there is one resource where that combination becomes surprisingly expensive. It looks far less dramatic than an Arctic mine or a giant port. It is dirt. Across the European Union, an acre of arable farmland averaged roughly $7,200 in 2024, around 5,300 pounds. That sounds cheap compared with urban property, but even this number hides enormous differences. In some parts of Europe, farmland sells for only a fraction of that. In others, it can cost more than a house in parts of the United States. You might assume the expensive fields simply have better soil. That is part of it, but it is nowhere near the full answer. Farmland competes with everything else humans want to put on flat, accessible ground: houses, warehouses, roads, factories, power lines, and businesses. And few countries squeeze more uses onto less space than the Netherlands. The Netherlands is smaller than West Virginia, yet it contains more than 18 million people, major cities, dense transportation networks, heavy industry, one of Europe's largest ports, and an enormous agricultural sector. Dutch agricultural exports were worth roughly 129 billion euros in 2024, although an important share of that came from imported products being re-exported. That actually makes the geography more interesting, not less. The Netherlands is not just a place where food is grown, it is a place where food can be grown, processed, imported, sold, and shipped with unusual efficiency. Germany sits next door. Rotterdam connects it to the world. Roads, rivers, warehouses, farms, and processors are packed into a tiny area, and every one of them wants land. That pressure shows up in the price. Dutch arable land averaged around $46,000 an acre in 2024, roughly 34,000 pounds, more than 6 times the EU average. But even inside the Netherlands, one province stands apart: Flevoland. At first glance, it may be one of the least remarkable-looking places in Western Europe. It is almost completely flat. Huge rectangular fields stretch across the landscape. Roads run in unusually straight lines. Drainage canals cut through farmland beside planned towns. Yet in the latest comparable regional figures, Flevoland's arable land averaged about $88,000 an acre, roughly 65,000 pounds. That was the highest reported regional average for arable land in the European Union. And that brings us back to the strange fact from the beginning. A large part of this ground used to be water. Look at a map of the Netherlands from a century ago and Flevoland disappears. Not just the towns, not just the farms. The land itself is gone. In its place is the Zuiderzee, a broad inlet of the North Sea that once reached deep into the center of the country. Fishing boats crossed above places where potatoes and onions grow today. Sediment accumulated where highways now run. The water supported fishing and trade, but it also created a serious problem. Much of the surrounding Netherlands was low and vulnerable. and storms could push huge amounts of water toward communities around the Zuiderzee. The Dutch had spent centuries controlling water with dikes, canals, pumps, and polders. But eventually, engineers proposed something much bigger. Instead of protecting themselves from the Zuiderzee forever, they would change it. One of the main figures behind that idea was Cornelis Lely, a Dutch civil engineer who developed plans to close off the Zuiderzee and reclaim large sections of its floor. The plan could solve two problems at once. A barrier could reduce the threat from North Sea flooding. And behind that barrier, the Dutch could create something a small, crowded country badly needed: more land. Then the water made the decision more urgent. In January 1916, a severe storm pushed water into the Zuiderzee and overwhelmed dikes around its shores. Communities and farmland flooded. People were killed and livestock were lost. 2 years later, the Dutch Parliament passed the Zuiderzee Act. The Netherlands was about to redraw itself. There was just one problem. Drawing farmland where water existed was easy on paper. Making it work in the real world was different. The bottom of the Zuiderzee had spent generations underwater. If engineers pumped it dry, the newly exposed soil would be saturated, unstable, and completely untested on the scale they were proposing. The Dutch could build dikes around thousands of acres, but that would be pointless if the land inside them could not produce reliable crops. So before betting on the largest reclamations, they tried something much smaller. In 1926, near the village of Andik, engineers began enclosing a tiny piece of the Zuiderzee. It covered only about 100 acres. The purpose was to answer one question: what actually happens when you turn the bottom of this sea into land? They pumped the water out and watched. Agricultural experts studied how the exposed soil dried. They tested drainage. They learned how the ground settled and how crops behaved once cultivation began. It was essentially a prototype landscape. The Dutch were testing the future on 100 acres before attempting it across tens of thousands. And the strange thing is what this experiment represents today. At the time, engineers were trying to determine whether this former seabed could become useful farmland at all. A century later, farmland created from the same larger system would reach some of the highest agricultural prices reported anywhere in the European Union. But first, the Dutch needed to separate the sea from the ocean. That required the Afsluitdijk. Completed in 1932, this enormous barrier runs roughly 20 miles across what had been the mouth of the Zuiderzee. Once the final opening was closed, the old inlet was separated from the North Sea. Over time, the water behind it became the freshwater IJsselmeer. The Dutch did not drain the entire thing. They had done something more useful. They turned a dangerous arm of the sea into a body of water they could control. Inside it, engineers could build additional dikes around selected areas, isolate the water inside, and pump those sections dry. They had created the conditions to start manufacturing land on a scale Europe had rarely seen. The transformation came in stages. Wieringermeer became dry in 1930. The Noordoostpolder followed in 1942. Then, in 1957, Eastern Flevoland emerged. Southern Flevoland followed in 1968. Those last two dates are worth remembering. This was happening while Elvis Presley was releasing records, while the space race was beginning, and while television was spreading into homes across the Western world. Flevoland's creation is not ancient Dutch history. Large parts of the province are younger than the interstate highway system in the United States. The Netherlands was still adding huge pieces of dry ground to its map in the second half of the 20th century. Altogether, the major land reclamations of the Zuiderzee works created roughly 408,000 acres of new land, about 637 square miles. That is more land than the entire city of Houston. But when the water disappeared, farmers could not simply drive tractors onto the seabed. Drainage channels had to pull water from the soil. The ground had to dry and settle. Plants were used to help prepare parts of the new surface. Roads, canals, utilities, and farms had to be constructed where none had existed before. The Netherlands had created land, but now it had to create a functioning landscape on top of it. That is why Flevoland looks almost unnatural from above. Most European countryside is messy because it has been accumulating decisions for hundreds or even thousands of years. A road bends around an old village. Property lines follow streams. Fields fit around boundaries created long before tractors existed. Flevoland started with almost none of that. Roads could be drawn straight because there were no medieval towns in the way. Farms could be divided into large geometric blocks because there were no ancient property lines to respect. Drainage canals could go where engineers wanted them. The unusual geometry is not a design style. It is evidence that the landscape is new. Then came the cities. Lelystad, named after Cornelis Lely, was built on the reclaimed ground and became the provincial capital. Almere began developing later and grew into one of the largest cities in the Netherlands. In 1986, Flevoland officially became the country's 12th province. Think about how unusual that is in Europe. This is a continent where cities, borders, and farmland can be thousands of years old. Yet one of the Netherlands' provinces exists on ground that was largely beneath water when World War II began. Today, hundreds of thousands of people live there, and the original question from that little experimental polder still hangs over everything. Did the farmland actually work? It did. Much of Flevoland contains young marine clay formed from sediment deposited beneath the former Zuiderzee. Once the land was drained and prepared, these soils proved highly suitable for intensive farming. Potatoes, onions, sugar beets, grains, and vegetables spread across the polders. Researchers studying reclaimed Zuiderzee soils found substantial natural reserves of certain nutrients when some of this land first entered cultivation. The Dutch had not simply created dry ground. They had exposed productive soil, learned how to manage it, and connected it to one of the most advanced agricultural systems in Europe. The 100-acre experiment near Andik had asked whether seabed could become farmland. Flevoland answered that question on a massive scale. But fertile dirt alone does not get you to $88,000 an acre. This is where everything from earlier in the story comes back together. Flevoland's farms sit inside a country where usable land is scarce. They have access to dense roads and waterways. Agricultural processors and exporters operate nearby. Rotterdam connects the Netherlands to global shipping. The Rhine connects it deep into continental Europe. Germany, one of the world's largest consumer markets, begins just across the Dutch border. The soil is useful, but the system around it multiplies that usefulness. It is the same reason Rotterdam works. A port is not valuable only because ships can dock there. A field is not valuable only because crops can grow there. And that makes the final comparison almost absurd. Across the EU, arable farmland averaged around $7,200 an acre in 2024. In Flevoland, it was about $88,000, roughly 12 times as much. That does not mean every acre sells for exactly that price, and it does not mean a Dutch field is objectively worth more than central London, Rotterdam Harbor, or a rare earth deposit in Sweden. Those are completely different kinds of value. But among the European Union regions covered by Eurostat's figures, Flevoland recorded the highest average price for arable land. The same landscape engineers once had to test just to find out whether farming there was practical had become some of the most expensive agricultural ground in the EU. Go back to the map of Europe. London is still wealthy. Paris is still wealthy. Monaco and Switzerland have not suddenly become cheap. But those places represent only the most visible kind of value, what people will pay to occupy a location. Underneath that is another map. Rotterdam appears because enormous amounts of trade can pass through it. The North Sea coast appears because electricity has to reach land somewhere. Northern Sweden appears because modern industry needs what is buried beneath it. And then Flevoland appears. Flat, ordinary-looking farmland whose value comes from productive soil, extreme scarcity, infrastructure, access to markets, and one detail none of the others can match. Less than a century ago, much of it was underwater. The Dutch did not stumble across some forgotten piece of valuable land. They closed off a sea, pumped sections of it dry, learned how to turn the exposed seabed into farmland, built roads and cities across it, and connected that new ground to one of the most productive economic systems in Europe. Today, that farmland averages around $88,000 an acre. The strangest part of Europe's hidden wealth is not what somebody discovered beneath the land. It is that some of the land had to be built first. If you want to see another part of Europe where the map is hiding something much bigger than it looks, check out the video up next.